Award in Modern Arabic Literature. The second is Arab Women Writers' Constructions of Islamic Feminism. And the third, more general theme is the notion of Arab cultures, especially in Syria, the Arab Gulf, and networked connections between Arabs and Muslims around the world. Miriam is the author of several books, including Women and the War Story, Dissident Syria, Making Oppositional Arts Official, and Tribal Modern, Branding New Nations in the Arab Gulf. And also, she's the author of a novel called Hayati, My Life, published in 2000. Miriam is a much-loved teacher and mentor, not only at her home institution, but as a visiting professor in various universities in Tunisia, Romania, Indonesia, Qatar, and Istanbul. And I'd like to share two personal anecdotes that capture why Miriam is special. The first is when it was 1998, almost 20 years ago, when I had just arrived as an adjunct professor at Duke in the Art and Art History program. And of course, there were no slides of Islamic architecture in their slide collection. I had to make my own. And so, I don't know if you remember in those days, pre-digital era, you had to have a copy stand, which you would reverse mount your camera. And so I was standing on my chair for hours at a time in my office, making slides from books. And I was feeling tired and kind of lonely. And the phone rang, and it was Miriam calling to introduce herself. And she said, "We've been waiting a long time for someone to teach Islamic architectural history." She invited me to their Mediterranean Studies group, which opened up a wonderful network of colleagues, several of whom became friends, including Miriam and her husband, Bruce Lawrence, who is, as many of you know, a scholar of Islamic history and civilizations. And the second anecdote is that Miriam and Bruce had the idea to design a garage at their beautiful house in Hillsborough, North Carolina, with a library. And I was practicing as an architect at the time, and Miriam and Bruce had invited me to dinner, and she showed me the hillside behind their house and said, "If you can design the most beautiful garage in the world, we'll build it." And we did. I mean, I know it was the most beautiful in the world, but it evolved significantly. It evolved significantly into a guest house and library with North African architectural influences. So around the time this happened, Miriam said to me, "Do you know why we hired you?" It turned out that Maya Lin, the designer of the Vietnam War Memorial, had just been to lecture at Duke. And she advised Miriam and Bruce, "Don't hire a well-established architecture firm. Hire someone young with new ideas who can think outside the box." And I mention that because I see that same spirit in Miriam's book, Dancing in Damascus. She has this great desire to seek out and encourage new and creative voices, and also to build communities that ultimately stretch across the globe. So thank you for being here, Miriam.
Thank you. Such a lovely introduction. And thank you to all the various sponsors and to many friends. So I sort of feel as though I'm at home, even though it's my first time here. And you were mentioning the Mediterranean group. Eric Zakim was a central part of the Mediterranean group. So today I want to talk to you about the cultural effervescence of the Syrian Revolution. A revolution that many have buried already in the way that the Arab Spring has been buried. You know, it's not an Arab Spring, it's an Arab fall, it's an Arab winter. And for people who have been part of the beginnings of the protests, the uprisings, they continue to be important revolutionary movements. 6 years into the 2011 Arab Spring, many Tunisians, Egyptians, Yemenis, and Syrians continue to call their uprisings against cruel, corrupt regimes revolutions. Although each popular movement seemed to fail after initial successes, many of the revolutionaries still resisted their leaders, their frustration matched with an almost impossible hope. And hope is, I hope, going to be something that you retain throughout what I'm going to say today. So how is this hope possible, especially in a place like Syria, where the Assad dynasty was more violent and uncompromising than any other Arab regime? On March the 15th, 2011, after 40 years of atomization, and atomization here I'm using Hannah Arendt's notion of a population that has been so terrorized that they will trust no one. In fact, probably the only person that they would trust would be the leader. So establishing a kind of relationship of father to child with the leader and afraid of everyone else, afraid of being reported, the term taqarir. So after 40 years of atomization and apparent acquiescence to tyranny, the people had risen up to say no to injustice and denial of all freedoms. Overnight, citizens who had not trusted each other, who'd never dared to assemble long enough to consult and strategize about their situation, were thronging the streets. Today, despite spiraling violence and the international agreement that what we're witnessing in Syria is a civil war or a proxy war, many Syrians continue to believe in their revolution. So what is this revolution that inspires dreams and hopes in the wasteland of today's Syria? Over the past 5 years, Syrians, including those who use pseudonyms in their interviews with Wendy Perlman for We Cross the Bridge and It Trembled, I hope some of you have heard of this book. It has just come out and has had much acclaim. So many of the people that she interviewed continued to affirm in 2017 their faith in the revolution. So what I'm going to be talking about in a while, in what follows, is the artists, the creative people. But the people that she interviewed are ordinary people. So it isn't just that the artists are fantasizing the revolution. So somebody who calls herself Rima told Perlman in fall of 2012, and I'm going to go through 12, 14, 16, and 17 so that you get a sense of the progression or the lack of progression in the notion that it's a revolution. So Rima says, and I quote, "Syrians defeated the regime the moment they went into the streets. We will not allow anyone to steal our dreams again." In Antakya in September 2013, Khalid, a Free Syrian army commander who had defected from the Assad army, assured Perlman, and I quote, so this is 2013, "The revolution will not give up," even though he acknowledged that personally he'd reached a point of despair. And I thought this was such an interesting quote because you can feel that for yourself, it's all over, that there is no hope for you. But the faith in the revolution is intense. Okay, great. In 2014, Sharif Kiwan, the spokesperson for the emergency cinema collective Abu Nadara, confirmed that the revolution survives and simmers underneath the mayhem. And I quote, "We don't feel we're dealing with a war, we're dealing with a revolution. I don't know what revolution is, I can't explain it. But we have the feeling that we're in front of huge breakdowns, ruptures, something very violent and something very beautiful. So we cannot qualify this. We accept the idea that it's a revolution." In 2016, a man who calls himself Abdurrahman told Wendy Perlman, and I quote, "We come from the revolution and we still support our revolution." Ahmad explained that what happened in the revolution, that what had happened to the revolution is due to the media. I'm sorry, I was in Sonoma in the fires, and I have had problems with my throat. Imad explained how it happened. The media has tied the revolution to terrorism. In this way, the revolution gets buried, it's getting lost, and that alone is a crime against everything that has happened in Syria. Marcelli in Gaziantep, also in late 2016, told Perlman, "To me, the revolution is like a child with special needs. I believe in it and can't abandon it." So what all of these people are saying is the revolution is something violent and beautiful, that the revolutionaries themselves didn't understand, but to which they remain totally committed despite the world's attempt to bury it. The commitment testifies to a remarkable ability to hope for a better future. So here, of course, we have an image of the Assad dynasty. In the middle, we have Hafiz Assad, and on the left is Basil, and on the right is Bashar. So this was before 1994. Basil died in a car crash. And in Syria, when my husband Bruce Lawrence and I were there in 95, 96, he was referred to as the Lamborghini martyr because he was driving a Lamborghini and apparently it crashed into a tree, and that's how he died. But he became venerated like a saint. So in Kargaha, which is a town in the north that the Assad family comes from, there was in 94 a shrine along with the green cloth over the sarcophagus, sort of, and with a Quran recited 24/7, reciting the Quran. The revolution surprised the Syrians and, of course, scholars of Syria and the world. Who could have predicted that a people living under an absolute dictatorship for 40 years would, from one day to the next, so it seemed, rise up against the regime? Decades of censorship had driven freedom of thought and expression deep underground. But there, like Marx's mole, those freedoms had survived and tunneled new pathways. The first opportunity for the mole to surface briefly came in 2000 when Hafiz died and his son Bashar took over. So when Bashar first took over, he was he seemed to be promising to be very liberal, and in fact, it was after, of course, what we had seen happen in Jordan with King Hussein being succeeded by his son Abdullah, opening things up, when King Hassan II of Morocco died, Mohammed VI took over, and he was also much more liberal in the beginning. And so what happened when Bashar took over was a loosening of this really tight hold. And we have what was referred to as the Damascus Spring. And during the Damascus Spring, there were what they called muntadayat. Muntada is like the Parisian salon, where people would gather and they would discuss cultural events. They would discuss politics also. So as you can imagine, after 30 years of silencing under Hafiz, that was really opening things up. There was even the publication of Syria's first independent newspaper in almost 40 years, the satirical weekly Adomari, which means the lamplighter, that was managed by the renowned cartoonist Ali Farzad. So although he did not critique regime individuals, Farzad threw caution to the winds, as in this explicit depiction of a cell in Tadmor prison, what has been referred to as the dreaded kingdom of death near the ancient site of Palmyra. It's important to have some idea of the prison culture under Hafiz Assad, and that has actually returned. A lot of the big prisons were underground, so that you could actually be walking on underground prisons. And the prison near Palmyra in Syria is called Tadmor, was a really grim one, considered to be one of the worst prisons in the world. So here, of course, you can see what's happened. We have the interrogation tools on the wall. The prisoner is strapped. He's had his hand amputated, a foot amputated. We see some more of the saw, and then, of course, the torturer, who does have a soft heart after all, because he's weeping at a musalsal. Thank you. I was trying to think of the word in English. So modernization and liberalization have briefly been in the air. Political organizations formed and even issued declarations in social fora called muntadayat. People gathered to discuss what before had been forbidden. Top-down control began to weaken, especially after 2006, when there was a terrible drought and there was a feeling that the people were about to rebel because they were dying of hunger. And so it was after 2006, after 6 years more or less, because the Damascus Spring does not have a delimited date. Some people say it was a few months. Some say that it was from about 2000 to 2006. But there were many, many bad moments in those first 6 years where people who were becoming too outspoken politically were then punished. And so in 2006, we see media censorship returning. We see the Muntadayat being closed down. The genie, of course, was already out of the bottle. And even if the increasingly visible opposition was disunited, it was impossible to go back to the kind of control that Hafiz Assad had exerted. Thin cracks in the wall of fear that Hafiz Assad had carefully erected over 30 years began to yawn. Then in late 2010, the Arab Spring exploded from Tunisia to Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and Bahrain. So revolution was in the air, the feeling that if you stood up to a regime, you might, like the Egyptians or the Tunisians or the Yemenis, you might actually displace the ruler. And in mid-March, some schoolboys from the southern city of Daraa, picking up the mood of the moment, scribbled slogans on a wall specifically targeting, in this case, the ophthalmologist president. And I say ophthalmologist because it's Ijat Ador Ya Doctor. Can't hear it in English. So it's your turn, doctor. And also the usual Sha'b yurid isqat al-nizam, the people want the regime to fall. The boys, unlike elsewhere, the boys were arrested and tortured, and the popular response was immediate. Despite decades of prohibition on freedom of thought, speech, and assembly, Syrians flooded the streets and demanded justice and the ouster of Bashar. Across the entire country, they organized Friday demonstrations, Friday, of course, being the one day that Syrians could assemble because, of course, it's the Friday prayer. For an idea of how widespread the popular movement had become, consider the 25th of May, 2012, a Friday that is remembered for the brutal murder of the children of Hola. And on that one Friday, there were 939 cities, towns, and villages that hosted demonstrations. I think this also is important to remember, because when we think about Egypt or Tunisia or even Morocco, that isn't considered to be part of the Arab Spring, but certainly had its own kind of intifada, it was primarily either in the capital or in a few cities, but not in this widespread way, so deep into the countryside. Demonstrations were systematically suppressed. And by now, and it's probably even more, 450,000 have been killed. Over half of them civilians, and I think this is, again, really important to note. There are at least 9 million internally displaced. There are probably 5 million refugees. Countless numbers disappeared into prisons. Now, one thing that I didn't mention was when Bashar came to power, he closed down the 2 worst prisons. The one was Tadmor, that you saw in Ali Farzad's cartoon, and also in Mezze. So he closed the 2 down. He opened them up. Almost immediately after Daraa, he opened them up. And so we have no idea how many have been disappeared, but I will be talking more about what has happened in the Saidnaya prison, which I think then becomes emblematic of what happens to Syrians when they go to jail. So in other words, over half the population of 23 million in 2011 today is homeless. The more ferocious the repression, the more people joined the opposition, and of course some are joining the opposition outside the country. Some fought for this new order by demonstrating in the streets and exposing their bodies to lethal danger. They knew that they were living an extraordinary moment in history. Some produced creative expression in response to the regime's violence. They painted, wrote stories, turned citizen journalism into videos and films. Now here's our friend Ali Farzad. And what happened to him in August was that some thugs, some regime thugs, picked him up, took him out into a desert area near the Damascus airport, beat him up, and crushed his fingers. So he saw a photograph of himself in prison with his hands bound, and this is his own version to Bashar. Don't think you can stop me. Then we have rapper Ibrahim Qashush. Terrible story. So Qashush sang, but he wasn't as lucky as Farzad, who had been left on the side of the road they thought, to die. So Qashush was murdered the day after leading a crowd in a long liturgy commanding Bashar to go. Yalla Bashar, irhal ya Bashar. And when his body was discovered in the Orontes River the following day, its throat had been cut, ritually disfigured, to make sure that the message was clear. And the idea, of course, was that those vocal cords would never again produce a sound. As has happened in many of these cases in the Arab Spring countries, and I'm thinking, for example, of Bahrain and that square where everybody was meeting, the Pearl Square. The minute that they destroyed the Pearl statue, it went viral. Everybody was wearing it as a symbol of their participation in the opposition. So the same happened with Qashush. Now, this is an image that Wissam al-Jazairi did of Qashush. He calls it the sparrow of freedom. I don't know where he got the word sparrow from, but he, like many, and you will see a number of these coming images that have English in them, because the point is they want to get through to an international audience. So Wissam al-Jazairi was one of many to illustrate what happened to Hashush. And notice, of course, that what we have is, it looks like the dove. I would call it the dove of freedom, soaked in blood, but it still is able to fly. This whole notion of hope. So posting hundreds of images of anger, and when I say hundreds, and I'll be talking about thousands, I'm not exaggerating. I'm just reporting what is available on the internet in terms of numbers, of verified numbers. So posting hundreds of images of anger, defiance, and hope to his Facebook site, Al Jazairi, who's born in 1990. Most of the creative workers that I'm going to be talking about are young, sort of in their 20s. That's young for me, but 20s and 30s. So he'd been curating the revolution online. He's creating a memory of its countless contestations to the crimes of the regime and of all who joined forces to crush the people's revolution. Like so many artists, he was drawn to dance, to defiant dance, that expressed the revolutionaries' endless determination to stay with the revolution at the cost of their freedom and even their lives. Now, Ahmed Jodeh, Dance or Die, this photograph was taken earlier this year, just so that you don't forget that this notion of freedom, of the revolution, and of dance is something that continues until today. He was actually picked up from Syria by the Dutch National Ballet Company, and he's now dancing for them. Now, I'm going to show you a short video, and I hope I will. Is Amy here?
Just click on it.
Click the, oh,
On the video itself.
How do I? So let me just tell you a little bit about this. Is it? So, oh yeah, I see. Okay, yeah. Now I'll let you enjoy it. Yeah, go to me then. Yeah. Oh, here. Yeah. Jumbo. Can you see? Should I?
It's okay.
This is the Damascus Cultural Center. He'll return. Think about what he's doing.
Ni mediar un previo aviso, hacer un juramento, hemos hecho un compromiso. Sin palabras nos marchamos, ni te olvido ni me olvidas, sin hacer un juramento. Hemos hecho un compromiso. Tu destino es como el mío. Si eres barco, yo soy vela. Si eres agua, yo soy río. Si eres llama, yo lamento. Nadie habló de enamorarnos, pero Dios así lo quiso. Hacer un juramento, hemos hecho un compromiso.
So unfortunately there isn't enough time to watch it all, but you've seen about half, and I just thought it was important to see this, because also the flamenco in Syria, whenever people have seen this, is, well, that isn't Syrian, but you know, we have flamenco dances in America, and it's not American. So here's another example of dancing, and this, a little like the cover of my book, which I showed you earlier. So this is Wissam al-Jazairi's. I think I was told, was it with Peter, and you said, I think you asked me who's a photographer, and I said, it's not a photographer. So I don't know if you see what's going on here, but it's part of almost a genre of Syrian revolutionary art, and it's what I call inter-iconic. So Tamam Azam started it a while ago, and that is found footage online of a recently destroyed building, and in some cases, some of the images, you can see the smoke rising up out of the recently destroyed building. And then Tamam Azam's thing is to take masterpieces of European art and then to place, to superimpose the European masterwork onto the detritus of this building. So this, for those of you who know, of course, is Matisse's Dances of 1906. Memorializing the aesthetic of resistance, each artist activist insists on preserving the revolution, even if only for the time being, in art online. To mention a few collective sites, and these sites are actual sites and they're online sites. So there is a place above Beirut, it's called Art Residence Alay, and it is run by a Syrian woman who escaped from Damascus in 2012. And what she has done is she has taken an Ottoman stable, and she has converted it into an art residency. Absolutely gorgeous place, where she has artists escaping from Syria come for the very least 2 weeks, sometimes up to 6 weeks or 2 months, where they can create art if they like. They don't have to, but it's just a place for khud nafas. It's a place to take a breath and then move on, because Beirut has become a kind of launching point for many Syrian artists. Many are going to Germany if they succeed, and many are going also to England and France. So Art Residence Ale is one site. Another is the Ayam Gallery, founded in Damascus during the Damascus Spring, and the owner moved his gallery first to Beirut, and then Dubai, and then Jeddah. And what he's been doing is he's been sponsoring these artists, giving them quite a lot of money, with the expectation that every month they will produce 1 or 2 artworks. Now, Tamam Azam is an Ayam artist who has done pretty well. So if you get a print of this, for example, they sell for as much as $12,000. Beirut art scene, Syria Speaks, and then the popular online Arabic, French, and English website, The Creative Memory of the Syrian Revolution. And I'm going to now talk a little bit about this. So here it is. This is an extraordinary site that a woman called Sana Yazigi, who's a graphic artist, graphic designer, she put this site together. And she now has, in the beginning she was doing it on her own, then she hired 2 or 3 people, and now she has usually around 10 people, and it's constantly changing because the work is so intense. They are virtually 24/7 trolling the internet for images, so that if you, and I invite you all to look tonight when you go to your, when you go home or when you have your computers handy, just go and see what she's done today. I should have looked for today, but I didn't. And I'm sure you will find at least 2 or 3 items that have been posted. So at moments when things are really, really intense in Syria, there will be lots of posts. Now, what she insists on is that whatever is posted to the site is not a historical document. No photographs of anything that somebody has seen. No footage of something unless it has been in some ways worked. It is an expressive articulation of the artist's reaction. So here we have our friend Ali Forzat again. His was one of the very, very first items that was posted to the site. Ali and Sana are good friends. And here, Ta'atuf Duwali, so international sympathy written at the bottom, and then the Syrian opposition holding out a beggar's bowl into which the international community is dropping crocodile tears. So for her, it is really, really important that this site only have expressive responses to these events, because she says the events themselves, when they have been distributed around the world and there is a horrendous collection of photographs that was brought to actually the American attention. I think it was like 3 years ago. Shibley, you may know this. The Caesar, a guy who called himself Caesar, he was a policeman, and he was under orders to torture prisoners. But what he did was he secretly recorded them. And in the thousands of photographs that he then brought for the international community, sure that would get some kind of reaction. After all, when we saw the bodies in the camps that were liberated in Europe in 45, that was the never again, which of course now we see here being repeated. So at this point there is, and in fact it started earlier, it started around 2014, a lack of conviction that if you just show horror, that it's somehow going to do something, that it will be politically motivating. And so that was something that I looked at in my book, that artists became more and more creative, trying to find ways to make the image, to make the event stick. Obviously, producing affective art. So what I'm talking about is, in some ways, what I'm calling a revolutionary habitus. And I see this site, the creative memory of the Syrian Revolution, as being one revolutionary habitus. At this point, it has archived Sanaa Yazigi and the people working with her over 27,000 items. I mean, they count everything. And their mission is to establish a collective creative memory in order to resist oblivion. Now this, of course, is the fear, right? The people are just going to forget. These authors, and I'm quoting from the mission statement, are adopting the revolution and dedicating their work to the revolution. The website aims to enhance the impact of the creative Syrian resistance, to reinforce its place in the revolution, to gather, archive, and spread the messages it expresses, and to help create networks between its main actors and the outside world. Here the artist, and this I think is crucial, the artist is considered a citizen before anything else, resisting with his art and standing by his people's fight. Memory, the place of creative resistance in the revolution, networking Syrians inside and outside the country, the artist as citizen, and importantly also a human being who's much more than the ubiquitous, anonymous refugee whose victimhood occupies international headlines. The site brings together thousands of formerly atomized citizens as empowered members of a virtual community. And she wrote to me in an email saying, "It is empowering to feel that we are presenting evidence of the people's counter-discourse to that of the regime. To resist amnesia and the erasure of our legitimate cause is a battle. It is very painful to work on remembering when forgetting seems necessary for survival. We are driven by indignation." So you may hear the echoes from the various revolutions, even in Spain around 2011, Los Indignados. So in October 2016, the Festival International des Arts de Bordeaux invited Yazigi to participate in the festival with 30 pieces. Now, actually, I'm not sure how I can go back, but if you remember that picture of the little girl painting hope, notice again, of course, the word hope. This was done, initially it was anonymous, and we now have learned his name. He's sort of considered the famous graffitists in American graffitists.
Banksy?
Banksy, thank you. British, Syrian Banksy did that image. So she was invited to participate with 30 pieces from her 25,000 pieces online. And she decided to focus on hope. And so that was the main image that she had there. And what was important about this festival, it was the first time that she left anonymity. She had wanted to remain anonymous. She didn't want the site to be about her. She wanted it to be about all of the Syrian revolutionaries in whatever shape or form they came. And now she is very much associated with the site. And she said when she had to contact these various artists for their images, she was afraid that they would have been annoyed with her because she had not asked for permission. You know, if you have 25,000 items and now 27, you're not going to ask permission for each one. And she said that she was absolutely delighted that they had in fact been really happy to be collected together in, and here I will quote Thompson when he says, they're associated with each other in a place to become, a collective becoming machine that produces a new kind of person. Their identities are changing. Through their new awareness of each other and recognition of their creativity in common, artists, activists enter a single space, a revolutionary habitus. Knowledge of their collective presence on this communal site may change their perception of themselves. So I talk a little bit more about that, but I thought it was important to spend a final few minutes on the Amnesty International report of February the 7th of this year that was called the Human Slaughterhouse. And in it, Amnesty International has documented that between 2011 and 15, the Assad regime had authorized 13,000 hangings. Now, hanging is also important to connect back to Hafiz Assad, because that was his favorite way of executing prisoners, and the way in which it was done. And I spoke with a number of prisoners when I was in Damascus in the 90s, and they explained, and I had read this in one of the stories and couldn't understand the story because it was so allegorical. They would be hung in the yard, so that when the prisoners were taken out for half an hour to walk in the morning, they would see their companions who had been hanged the previous night. So very much about the spectacle that, of course, Foucault talks about in Discipline and Punish. So what we have is, I've lost part of it, but it doesn't matter. Within a day, so on February the 8th, and you can go to the site, you will see there were 7 images that were posted immediately to the creative memory of the Syrian Revolution. Now this one by a man who calls himself Dali, D-A-A-L-I, again, obviously the European connection, but he calls himself a Syrian revolutionary artist who at some point may reveal his name. But here you'll notice, of course, the hanging, and I connect it to this earlier image in 2013 by Mohammed Omran, and Omran explained to me what he was doing here. In fact, he had been in Copenhagen, and he was part of at a kind of inter-arts project for Syrians, and he was working with a poet called Golan Haji. And the way they worked is Golan would write 2 lines of verse, and then he would paint a bit. And then, inspired by Omran's work, Haji would then continue to produce verse. And so here on the spiked wheel is Hafiz Assad. And what they all have talked about is how Hafiz Assad, and the term that is often used, continues to rule from the grave. And he continues to rule from the grave because when Bashar took over, pretty much unexpectedly, because when his brother Basil, who had been prepared to take over, he was not. He was indeed in London studying ophthalmology. So he had no setup. He had no cabinet, and so all of his father's men then continued to work as they had before. And so the helicopters with the sunglasses, for those of you who know the Shabiha, so the government thugs who are part also of the security service, they're known for wearing sunglasses. So they're the Shabiha. And on the right are these bodies. And what Golan Haji talks about in his poem is the distorted bodies, what in fact happens to these cadavers is that very often the penis is cut off and put in the mouth. So those are the cadavers on the side. This, I think, is an extraordinary piece by Hani Abbas. Remember, these are all the next day. So before the 7th of February, nobody really knew what was going on in Sednaya. So I've talked to you about Tadmor and Mezze, the 2 terrible prisons that were closed. Sednaya remained open. Sednaya, actually a very important center of very early Christian culture. St. Paul and Thekla were supposed to have been there. So here, of course, we see him recycling Dali. What we see is, this is the prison underneath. So these are the wings of the prison. And so this notion, when I say recycling Dali, I'm of course talking about his 1951 Christ of St. John of the Cross. And so is this a scapegoat who's going to bring some kind of, I don't know, what would he bring? Whatever. Abu Yusuf, here the Arabic and the Bashar with his cheeks full of recently devoured human flesh, which we then see in another image by Ala Al-Laqta. Terrifying details about the destruction or the execution of 13,000 prisoners in Sarinaya. And then Abed Naji's, interesting what he's done here, of course, is he's used the UN logo to ironic effect. So instead of the olive branch wreath embracing the UN, the familiar UN vision of the world centered on the North Pole, of course it's a hangman's noose. The words are in English, so here you can see all of it in English. And the 2 words, keep calm, do people know where that comes from? Yeah.
Winston Churchill.
Yes, exactly. So this is taking back to World War II. Don't worry, everything's fine. So here we have artist activists who within one day of the report have given us their anguished responses to the report. Those wanting to read the actual report of when, why, and how the 13,000 from Saidnaya were hanged, or to see the accompanying photographs, the actual photographs, have to search elsewhere, for here they will find only created responses. Curating, archiving, and promoting the tsunami of revolutionary creativity, the creative memory of the Syrian Revolution has become a warehouse for the new. And of course, the key point being to challenge amnesia. So here, after the response to the Amnesty report, we had the celebration of the 6th year of the revolution. And so what I'd like to point out is the flag. So the flag with the 3 stars, you know, Hafiz Assad's flag had 2 stars. This one has 3. The colors have been reversed. And this flag goes back to the resistance to the French in the 40s. This was the flag that the revolutionaries carried then. So 6 years and the revolution continues. So in fact, I think what one can say is that the revolution is being continued in this expressive, creative form. And I wanted to mention that yesterday, just before leaving, I received an invitation from Sana Yazigi. So she's the designer of this creative memory of the Syrian Revolution. And it was an invitation that is to an event that's being hosted by the Ebert Foundation and the Swiss Embassy in Beirut to attend the October the 26th launch of a book. So Sana Yazigi has moved from total anonymity through the festival in Bordeaux in 2016 to a level of visibility. And now she has just put together a book entitled The Story of a Place, The Story of a People. Listen, the beginnings of the Syrian Revolution. The beginnings, 2011 to 2015. Interestingly, of course, the same dates as the Amnesty International report. So those 4 years. But for her and for many of the revolutionaries, it's a beginning. And I should just close with a very short anecdote from the guy who, Marzuki, was the
Hamas guy is Marzuki.
No, the guy who briefly was the president of Tunisia.
Oh, yeah.
Marzouk. Yeah. Marzouk? Okay, so I was in Aix last summer, and not this year, the year before, and he was giving a talk about the Tunisian Revolution and disappointed, obviously talking about the disappointment of the revolution. But then he ended and he said, oh, I wish I would be alive 50 years from now, because 50 years from now, we would be saying, it was so tough, but wasn't it worth it? So I think that what he said is what drives the Syrian revolutionaries. Thank you.
Does the art's work go beyond the resistance and displaying the resilience and kind of say something about more specific about the future, like what it is that we are picturing happening and kind of imagining, in other words, is it imagining the next step?
You know, I would have to go through that site in greater detail, and I have spent hours and hours and hours looking at it. I think it's really hard to do anything beyond hope, because there's no leadership, no one who is the clear leader of the opposition. There's no clear ideology, and when I was in Paris 2 years ago, I went to a meeting of a group called Surya Horiya. They're a sort of an underground left group of Syrian expats. And there was some discussion with two guys who had just turned up from Syria. They just escaped from jail and had come to Paris, and they were very nervous about being found, not necessarily by the French, but by the Syrian government. And so there was a big discussion about the revolution and how it had started and who was responsible for its failure. And one of them said, well, of course, we didn't have leaders and we didn't have an ideology. And that was then discussed among a large group of people, sort of like here today. And they said, well, we don't have an ideology, but maybe that's not such a bad thing, because ideology has now become the property of Islamic State, Daesh, and of Islamist groups. And so maybe the ideology isn't what we want. So if you don't have a leader and you don't have an ideology, at this point, I think the key is we mustn't forget, and we have to stay committed to Syria. So I was talking in Manchester in July. A group of Syrian expats there had put on a festival, and they're working hard, as are people in Beirut, Hassan Abbas in particular, I'm thinking. They're working with people to train them to citizenship. So Hassan Abbas's group in Beirut is, something Muwatana, so citizenship for SL. Anyway, and they have regular seminars, training women to demand their rights. So gender issues are very much part of the way in which they're thinking about the future.
They are looking beyond.
Oh no, absolutely, they are. But your question was making me think more in terms of a kind of concrete. Is there a blueprint, to use architectural language? And as far as I know, there isn't. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. It's really wonderful to document the art. Obviously, it's every conflict is a story to be told through there. But as I was listening to you, though, the Syrian conflict is extremely complicated. And what we have here is a too simple a story of revolution or as a dictatorship. Obviously,
Yeah.
there's that. But that, I would argue, is but a small part of the conflict, because it's a multi-layered conflict. There's a little bit of revolutions against the government, there's ethnic conflict, there's international strategic competition that is exploiting every group that probably is more than 50% of the conflict. So the representation that came across through this art is mostly about one important part. That's where it started, obviously. But it didn't tell the full story, or the diversity even of the art that could have depicted a completely different picture, or accusation, or atrocities by what people call terrorists, or ISIS or Al-Qaeda. And as you know, here in America, Syrian Americans are highly divided on this issue. Many of them think of revolutionaries as being exploited by Gulf regimes or ISIS, or playing part of a strategic picture. Some are completely on the other side of the equation, see the Assad regime as a terror regime who's just killing its own population. And the divide is very deep here, and I would argue maybe even a majority actually take Assad's side for a variety of reasons that have to do with ethnicity here in America, with the ethnic.
Oh, in America?
Because in
Really?
America, I'm talking about Syrian Americans, because it's probably true that a majority of Syrian Americans are Christians. I'm not sure, I mean, that's true certainly of Lebanese, it's true of Arab Americans in general, 60% of them are. But that tells you something about the ethnic component of this conflict. So this is not telling that story. So do you do, I mean, in the book, is there a sense that this is limited to a particular cut of people who are expressing their views, and it's even limited to that? And just a corollary to that, obviously some of those artists are of course well known, and they're activists, and they're genuine, legitimate. But if you look at the war of ideas that is being waged globally, whether it's through the social media, or including using art and using cartoons for everything, because it's become part of the war that is being waged by strategic players. But when you look at Trump going to visit Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states are mobilizing all the artists and the cartoonists to portray it like he's welcome in Arabia, that people love him. We love you, Trump. And you look at all these things that became popular in the media, and they're all paid for by governments, placed in government-funded newspapers or television stations, but they're artists who need to make a living, and they're hiring them to do that. So do we get a sense of whether some of that also played into the Syrian Revolution, where art is actually part of that war that is being waged for and against, who's using it as an instrument? How much is it genuine expression of public, of the public sentiment, or exploitation by different parties? I mean, I'm just wondering, this is the complexity that is not obviously coming across.
Right. No, it's a really important question, and not one that I was addressing in this book, because, and some of the readers of the manuscript are saying, well, where is Assad's art? And so then my response was immediately, it's propaganda. So then isn't the other propaganda as well? And to what extent can we consider these works to be propaganda? Because I wasn't interested in propaganda, I specifically looked at the kind of work here, and part of what I've shown you here, that I don't think we can call propaganda, because we're back to no leader, no ideology. And these are people who are not part of a community, which is why I was talking about a revolutionary habitus, because I think it's only ex post facto and very recently that there is beginning to be a sense of, oh my goodness, we are a group of 1,000, 2,000, maybe 5,000 people who work in the creative arts, and who are trying to make sure that not only the world doesn't forget where this came from, but also creating a memory for the future. This is a term that I have seen repeated again and again. We have to have something for our children and our grandchildren. These are 20-year-olds who are already so old that they're already thinking of themselves as grandparents. So that there is this memory for the future. And so for me, Assad's propaganda or Daesh propaganda, I know it's effective, but it's something else, because it is driven by somebody's vision. I mean, to go back to Fatima's question about the future, where this work does not have a blueprint. Daesh does. Thank God they're on the outs, but I mean, you know, had I spoken here a month ago, they would have been still very much in power. And so I'm not interested in the art of a group with a leader, and therefore the artist as Hamid, as collaborator. They're not collaborating with anyone. So yes, I'm not getting a complicated story because I don't know if anyone can. Maybe you're the only one who would be able to do it. But I think it's going to take time for us to understand where did the Syrian democratic forces come from? Were they invented a week ago or something? So, yeah, I think all groups, for me, are not part of this project. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the engaging presentation. I just wanted to highlight a very important point. A lot has been written about citizen journalism in the context of the Arab Spring uprisings, and that's always linked with political resistance to the regime in power. What we have seen coming across in your presentation is definitely citizen art as a way to resist the burial, which is a term I really like here, the burial of the revolution. One of the quotes you had here was like, the revolution is not going to be buried, it's not going to be dismissed as terrorism or anarchy or chaos or something else that it's not. So I think this rhetorical and artistic act of resistance came across really nicely in your presentation, and I'm sure in the book as well. And I just want to highlight that I attended actually an exhibition here in Washington, D.C. It was an exhibition of the art of Syrian children, who are actually depicting with their own art, their own drawings, the tragic atrocities of the revolution and being refugees and being deposed of their own homeland. And it was very touching. And everybody who even did not know much about the Syrian conflict or why it was happening, they really had this kind of empathy and sympathy, and the humanitarian aspect came across very strongly in this exhibition of Syrian children's art. But my question is about the link between the local and the international. We saw that coming across in your presentation. The flamenco dance, we saw that in also some of the artistic work, the pictures, the depictions, some of that with work of international and renowned artists. Is there a bridge here between the local and the international that we should pay attention to? And what is the context and what is the meaning of this kind of bridge between the local and the international?
Yeah, great question. In the book, I deal with this a lot, and what I'm interested in is affect. What is going to move you, not just the first time, but every time you go back to an image. So we have, the little boy on the beach, and we have the little boy in the car who's, I mean, that worked, right? But then we kind of forget about it. But my argument is here, and what I was trying to say also in my talk today, is that this is precisely what these artists, and some of them are not great artists. They, some are, some aren't. But the whole point is, can we produce something that is going to move the viewer? And the viewer needs to be international. So it's not even targeting necessarily America. It could be because of the English, but English, of course, being lingua franca everywhere, it's an international audience. There's a group in a town called Kafranbel that has every single Friday prepared a banner, and the banner always is written in English, and it's always telling the world what's going on. Sometimes the banner will connect with, like a mass shooting here, and say, hey, we know what you're going through. And so it's always trying to connect. And you have to be very, very local, those of us who do literature stuff. Your work will only be really universal if it's very particular.
Yes.
Exactly. So that's the hope that's where it's going to work. Peter.
So what I find really fascinating in this is that, and I think I'd like to, I would ask you to reflect on the medium, on the internet, on the online. element of all of this, because all of this started in 2011. In 2011, the iPhone was just 3 years old.
Yeah.
And since then, since between 2011 and today, the technology has evolved tremendously. Bandwidth, the possibilities, how small devices can actually be used to produce this kind of art, to film, to take pictures that then can be turned into something different, even just using the technology at your fingertips. So, in a way, and I have a hard time formulating what I'm actually trying to say. There's a parallel development of the things that are happening, but also the agency that evolves out of the usage of technology.
Yeah.
And therefore, I think there's something going on here that has a lot to do with exile and the creation of community out of that technology, and the specific dynamics that evolve out of the situation that is created by technology, and at the same time by the tremendous suffering and the movement of people that's happening here. So there's something special going on.
You don't even have a question, and I have an answer.
Yeah. Well, then please turn this into my question.
Easy. A really wonderful example of precisely what you're talking about, and this goes back also to what you were talking about in terms of citizen journalism. Yeah. It's a filmmaker, Hassan Attasi, who also calls himself Ali Attasi. He's a filmmaker, made a number of interesting films. He set up a studio in Beirut called Bidayat, Beginnings. And this was in 2015, I think. So he's a trained filmmaker. And what he did was he was in touch with citizen journalists inside Homs, Hama, wherever, Aleppo, people that he knew. And he knew that they were using their telephones, and the phones were getting more and more powerful. And he said, shoot away and send me your rushes. Send them to me, but they could not be sent by email because then they could be intercepted. And so the rushes were delivered across the border. They were hidden on people's bodies and brought to Beirut. And in Beirut, he has a large apartment full of very sophisticated editing material. And he turns what Sana Yazigi was saying, I'm not dealing with this. And he's the same. That no longer has an effect. But if you turn it into a powerful story, a wonderful story about a sniper, and the sniper, he loves Fayrouz, and he keeps listening to her and waiting for, this isn't Homs, he wants to see if he can shoot anyone from the government. And then the telephone goes, and it's his mother, and how are things? Oh, everything's fine. And then he sees somebody and he shoots it, and his mother, the last thing we hear is, "My son, what was that?" Because she thinks, that he's safe. So that I think is an interesting example of this move from a very basic, almost primitive kind of recording to sophistication that has to happen outside.
But then the question: is there a future for this? The thing is, it's not a real community that exists anymore, and it is in a way, is it a reminiscence of an older kind of bourgeoisie, urban bourgeoisie that is trying to recreate to some extent a community, which then of course is an entirely virtual community and will never be recreated? Or is there a vision for for an actual physical recreation of this community that speaks out of that, or hope for that.
Yeah, I guess that's why I was talking about revolutionary habitus, because I think in some ways it can begin online with the awareness that many of these artists have, that they are living together in a virtual space, getting to know each other. The artists, some of them going to Bordeaux for the festival. I don't know about this book. I just corrected the English for the stuff on the back last week. That's really fast publishing, by the way. And so these stories are stories of people who she has interviewed and whom she has brought together. Now, whether you live in the same place doesn't really matter anymore. I was talking with Eric yesterday about Yael's work. She's working 24/7 and she doesn't leave the house. So she's definitely in a community with people that she's Skyping with all the time. So I think we are living in a world where living together doesn't have to happen in the same space. I mean, I think we lose a lot, but it's still living together. Eric.
I wanted to ask you an old-fashioned question, away from this newfangled stuff, and ask you about form, because a couple of things are striking in the images that you have shown us today, and I wanted to ask you to speak further about them, that have to do with the particular form of the image. And one is a huge reliance in these examples on a certain classicism, whether it's classical forms of dance, Matisse, crucifixion. So even the Godfather image, we could argue, relies on a certain classicism. And the second is, of course, all of these images, all of them, including this one, are palimpsestic to a certain point. I might even push and say, I'm trying not to avoid the term nostalgic, but certainly palimpsestic in the sense that they all rely on a huge complexity of layers. A lot of them are historical, or at least chronological, but in the construction of the formal image, there's a palimpsest. And so I wonder if we could, get away from the sociology business for a moment at least, and think about form within the images and the construction of the artistic expression.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I mean, just what more classical than a ballerina en pointe?
That's right.
And then
and it's a palimpsest as well.
Totally, because the nostalgia is in this image that is an image of destruction, but it looks, I mean, sepia. These are his colors. It's sepia, so it's of a time gone by, so it connects with Jasmenko, right? You're going back to the classical space of the cultural center. You're dancing. My argument to people who say, oh, it's not Syrian at all. I said, well, it's Mediterranean, and Syria is Mediterranean. So, yes, I think this again maybe connects with this question of the local and the international. That there has to be something that people around the world will recognize. Anyone will recognize the ballerina, right?
Is it a question of recognition, or is it a question rather of memory? To bring it back to the question of community.
Memory of a classical high
look
high
at this
culture.
one. There's certainly memory here, as you talked about the flag, this complex layering, the memory of in the flamenco. Video was about memory, the palimpsest of a memorial of a prior moment.
I mean, I guess then what we have to do is to go to Pierre Nora and Lieu de Mémoire. I mean, these are places. This is a place of memory. The flag is a place of memory. So these are memories for the future, but it isn't just a memory of today. It's a memory from the past. But I do think, and Fatima, I know you want to follow up on Eric. I do think that there is, in the use of these canonical, iconic images from Europe, also a plea for recognition. We're part of your humanity as well. Because a lot of the writing is about, you tried to dehumanize us, and we are human. I mean, this is something we hear from refugees all the time. We're treated like animals. We're not treated as human. This is at another level. We're human like the best of you. I mean, again, I think it's for affect. Sorry, Fatima.
Yeah, and I think they're saying we are human and look at the language we keep reinventing.
Yes.
You know, it's in a way connects with what Eric is saying. Something happened in Iran, which I think is a more kind of overt and obvious ways, when Jafar Panahi, the filmmaker, was under house arrest and they didn't let him make film. He used his phone and he followed himself around the house, and he created this thing that, of course, is nowhere near the films he has made. But when it came out, it was called "This Is Not a Film."
Oh.
So it's like you cannot take away from me either the memory or my ways of re-saying this again and again, whether it's through the internet, my phone, the images that are layered. I existed in the past, I am here now, I will be here in the future, and that's my language. That's my evolving language.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah, that's at least my reading of it.
Yes, because in most of these images, it's all together. Maybe that's the palimpsestic quality that you're talking about. It's about resistance, it's about anger, it's about contempt, all in terms of resistance rather than the construction of the new.
Even in this photo we have here in front of us now, there is on the wall there is a graffiti that says "Lan narka illa lillah" on the wall itself.
We won't
we're not going to
kneel
kneel down except to God only. So you see that this is a combination between the bus, your flag, you know, the people on the bus, and then you have what is written on the wall is also somehow complementing the whole message.
Very nice. I hadn't even noticed that.
So, just like to add on this notion of form, one aspect is that a lot of the images are literally photo montages, right? So it's literal layering. But the point that I was going to make about the flamenco, since I spent a lot of times thinking about United Spain and Andalus as Peter does, I don't think the flamenco was an accidental reference. I think that maybe the building being demolished in Damascus wasn't even in Damascus. Maybe it was a symbolic collapse of that ideal of Al-Andalus, Syria in exile, right?
Oh.
Because flamenco has very complex roots, and I'm not an expert on it. Obviously, gypsy culture is involved, but I think it's seen as a kind of authentic Andalusian form. So it seems to me to be a very, and it's also very aggressive.
So that would be super nostalgic.
I think that to me, it's
Going
what I
back to
saw
the
when
8th
I-
century or something. Yeah. Interesting. Good. Thank you very much.
I don't monitor
مرشد العام
I have yet to go into
Oh my gosh.
Different kind of research, right?
I like
Not in
research.
the math way.
Although it took us as long as we drove.
Yeah, so
It's right where it is. Hey, how are you?
no.
See you.
Well, that's
So is the dinner is